of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So the book of Leviticus is part of the Jewish Torah. The Torah contains 613 commandments, both positive, thou shalt, and negative, thou shalt not. Leviticus by itself contains 251 of those 613. It's a dense book filled with often obscure rules and regulations. Many of those today seem either offensive to us or irrelevant or meaningless. They include the proper way to worship in the Jerusalem temple, which no longer exists. There are laws about how people should and should not interact with each other and with God, but a number of these, if broken, call for the death penalty. One of the most often used passages against LGBTQ people comes from Leviticus. The theology is problematic. It could almost be said that Leviticus is so foreign and offensive to modern progressive values that we should throw the whole thing out. However, there are a few moments of beauty in this book. Chapter 19, for instance, contains instructions to leave the edge of your field unharvested so the poor can feed themselves from the gleanings. And in that same chapter 19, we find the commandment which Jesus quotes as the second most important of all, love your neighbor as yourself. That comes from Leviticus. But then also in chapter 19, Leviticus goes back to its old ways, and that's where you get the well-known verse of don't wear clothes made from two different kinds of thread, and don't plant your field with two different kinds of crop. So considering all this, it's fair to ask, what's the purpose of this book? What's the purpose of all of these rules and regulations? Before answering that question, though, there's one more high point in Leviticus that's worth mentioning, and it comes from chapter 25, the one immediately preceding the one we just read. This chapter, also far from perfect, with the usual offensive law thrown in here and there, but there are two big ideas in Leviticus 25 that are worth lifting up and will help us answer the question, what is the purpose of all these rules and regulations? The two big ideas are, one, that the land should have a Sabbath every 7 years, and the second is the year of Jubilee, when debts are forgiven every 50. The idea of resting the land every 7th year predates Leviticus for sure, probably goes back to when people first started doing agriculture and figuring out that leaving the land fallow every certain number of years increased the production. That's great. But what Leviticus does is it wraps it in the theology of Sabbath. So just as God needed rest after 7 days of creating, and humans and animals cannot and should not work for 7 days without rest, so the land needs that kind of rest every 7th year. And then if we look to our passage this morning, with all of its threats and of horrible punishment against people for transgressing God's laws, we find that one result, the key result of God's striking these people down, is that the land finally gets its rest. The people who in their greed have been wringing as much wealth and riches from the land as they possibly can, with no concern for the sustainability of their extractive practices, does that sound familiar? Will be punished, laid waste with disease, and removed by conquerors. For what purpose? So that the land can finally rest. A rest for the land is given as the reason for the punishment and the removal of the people. Notice also in our reading, and we even took some passages out here, how many times God tries to get through to the people and they refuse to listen and change. So this idea of Sabbath for the land, respect for the land, and understanding that the earth has limits that cannot be changed no matter how much we push it, is extremely relevant for us today. The second big idea in chapter 25 is the Jubilee year. Every 50th year, there should be a forgiveness, a mass forgiveness of debts. People who have fallen on hard times and had to sell themselves into debt slavery are set free. The land that has been sold because somebody's fallen on hard times reverts back to its original owner, so that powerful, wealthy people can't keep accumulating more and more and more land. Now, the details of how to do all that gets complicated, and scholars even wonder if this was ever truly practiced. But the concern for the economic justice here is very clear. The concern about wealth and power being concentrated into fewer and fewer hands is obvious. And with that, we're starting to get closer to answering the question, what's the purpose of all these rules and regulations? But looking at our reading from this morning from chapter 26, we'll get one more clue to that question. It's in verse 13 and verse 45, referencing the origin story of the people of Israel. We are told that they must follow all of these rules because they were once slaves in Egypt, and that God liberated them from their bondage. That memory of enslavement and liberation is part of the core Israelite self-identity, part of their core understanding of God. Verse 13 says, God says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt's land, who brought you out from being Egypt's slaves. I broke your bonds and made you stand up straight. You see, in Egypt, the Hebrew people experienced firsthand the tendency for money and power to flow uphill into the hands of a few wealthy, powerful people. They saw that Pharaoh's massive wealth and power depended on their oppression and depended on their stolen labor. They saw Pharaoh's hunger and greed never being satisfied. They saw God liberate them from the system of economic oppression by wearing Pharaoh down with plague after plague. Not so different from what we just read in Leviticus. They determined to always remember then the liberation that God granted them and never take that freedom for granted and never again submit themselves to a human king. But they needed an alternative to that human king. And the alternative they found was God. The ideal was that God would be their king, and God's will would then be interpreted through the laws, the rules and the regulations. Laws that would provide order, laws that centered God in their consciousness so that no human would ever force themselves into that centerpiece of our conscience. Laws that provided limits to how much wealth they could take from the land and how much wealth they could take from each other and how much any one person could accumulate. But let's be clear, these laws were not literally given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. They were made by the people over generations as they tried to create a fair, free, just society that was an alternative to Pharaoh's abusive economy. And those people absolutely got a bunch of stuff wrong in the process. But our question today is not what did they get wrong and what did they get right, which is important. But the question is, what's the purpose of all of these rules and regulations? And so the answer to that question, I think, is to keep power and wealth from flowing uphill. To keep power and wealth from flowing into the hands of the few, and to keep those powerful people from mistreating the land at the cost of current and future generations. The purpose of those rules and regulations is to protect the weak and limit the predatory ways of the strong. It's to keep the people from falling back into slavery. So with that in mind, let's talk about the Supreme Court decisions that we just heard. I'm no legal expert, but I've studied the gospel for a long time, so this comes from that perspective. It appears to me that the Supreme Court's decision to codify a high level of presidential immunity and to make themselves the ultimate arbiter of that immunity is a good example of power flowing uphill. One guardrail against the president becoming the pharaoh has been removed. In the same way, the Chevron decision undermines experts and government agencies from creating rules and regulations that protect the planet and limit the damage the powerful can do. So in the past 2 weeks, we've watched power flow a little bit more toward the top. Author Daniel Wolpert recently published a book called Looking Inward and Living Outward, the spiritual practice of social transformation. And he wrote this in response to the Supreme Court decisions. Is this ruling, he said, is this ruling really anything new in the US? Or is it just speaking the reality of our country out loud? To my mind, there are many presidents that have committed any number of crimes genocide, slavery, war crimes, killing of dissidents, spying on citizens, overthrowing governments, etc., etc. And of course, there has never been any conversation about trying those presidents in a court of law. The president has been immune from, quote, official acts and has used the full force of the government, the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, the DOJ, the military, to commit these acts. This ruling, he says, is just another way of saying, yep, that's the way America rolls. He says we are at this state of affairs in our country because of a long, long history of acts and actions that have led us here. The ruling class is continuing to do everything it can to hold on to power, and it will do so at any cost, as it always has. I would say that the ruling class has been doing that all the way back to Pharaoh's time. And I would disagree with Dan about one thing. Something new did happen here with these decisions. It was either just that the Supreme Court said the quiet part out loud, or that they did remove one of those guardrails. But I think Wolpert is right in that we don't like to think about how this country started. It started with power in the hands of a ruling class of white male property owners. And that as the country grew in wealth and power at the expense of the genocide of Native Americans, the enslavement of Africans, and the unpaid labor of women, we were able to exert our power on a growing scale, extracting wealth from the earth, enslaving and devastating the land, stealing abundance and bounty from current and future generations. And we've done that today on a massive scale. Leviticus 25 and 26 reminds us that this is nothing new. This is how people roll. This is what the wealthy and the powerful do. The wealthy and powerful will greedily accumulate more wealth and more power at everyone else's expense, and it's been happening for all of recorded history. Leviticus 26 warns us, as we continue to use and abuse the land, that the land has its limits, and God's patience with our abuse of the land has limits. Now, the saddest part of all of this is that many innocent people become collateral damage when a few of the most wealthy and powerful people in the world go up against God and push those limits and cross those boundaries. But that's probably another sermon. All of this, though, leaves us with some choices. As we read Leviticus and read about these limits to the land, we can ask ourselves, do we wait for God to finally remove us from the land so that the creation can have its rest? Do we wait and watch Pharaoh be Pharaoh? Do we keep acting like little pharaohs ourselves, hyper-focused on the accumulation of wealth? Or do we pay attention to the way the earth is already trying to strike us down? Do we listen to the warnings that the earth is already sending us in the form of stronger storms, more frequent storms, melting glaciers, rising tides, disappearing species? And as a result of hearing the cry of the earth, do we act? Hopefully we act. Hopefully we get it together. But doing so requires making the powerful and the super wealthy hear our voices and our values and change, and that we take back some of the ill-gotten gains. It requires us to do the hard, old-fashioned work of community organizing, advocating, voting, working, marching, committing acts of civil disobedience, and legislating. And there's a lot we can do on that front. And in the church, we also have a special task in addition to those things. We have to create in here what we want to see out there. We have to practice the values of sharing and simplicity and kindness and speaking the truth in love. We have to welcome all people here when Pharaoh is trying to make us afraid of each other. We have to be the change. And we do not get a law from heaven to help us do that. Instead, we have to listen to our conscience. We have to listen to our compassion and our empathy and our love. And the world we need to create must be founded on those. If we wait on God to intervene, we will not like the results. But we must put a loving, just God in the center of our collective conscience if we have any hope of change, if we have any hope of keeping Pharaoh out of that central spot. And unless we see that the ultimate power in all of this is love, we will not be able to stop human power and wealth from continuing to flow uphill, as it always tends to do. So we must stand up straight and remember that Pharaoh's economy and Pharaoh's politics only worked for Pharaoh. And we can do better for everyone. Amen.